am not Amy. I'm covering for her today. So I have about, probably less than 24 hours notice to prepare. That she had done all the background work, so I am just going to facilitate today. Thank you for giving me your time and attention and a little bit of grace as we kind of get through this lesson this week. I think it's a great one. They're all good. I always enjoy coming and being with you all and being a part of Sunday school. It's a blessing. But thank you again for being here this morning. I know it's a sacrifice to get here early, and it's so important. We're going to start week 2. I wasn't a part of last week's Men Under Construction, but I understand you all kicked off a new series last week. So this week, we're going to talk about Moses and the staff, what's in your hand. Ken is getting handouts for you all. I was trying to hold off a little bit longer to see if he could get in, but it won't be too much longer, and you guys will have a study sheet that you'll be able to follow along. But while we're waiting for him, why don't we go ahead and turn to the book of Exodus. We're going to start in chapter 2. I'm going to lean on you all to help me out a lot this morning. We'll just do this together and teach each other. Does somebody want to read Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 13?
Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced slavery. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong way, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?"
So when most people think about Moses, I don't know about you, I always think about the movie The 10 Commandments, right? With Charlton Heston. Everybody think about, that sort of big, thematic, sort of dramatic moments, the burning bush, the Red Sea, the plagues, Mount Sinai. But before Moses ever stood before Pharaoh publicly, Moses spent decades living in obscurity privately. And so before we skip over those hidden years that Moses had, we're going to dig into some of those deepest parts of Moses' story. Moses was raised between 2 worlds, right? So Moses enters scripture during one of the darkest moments in Israel's history. Pharaoh had become threatened by the growing Hebrew population in Egypt and issued an order that Hebrew baby boys were to be killed. Moses survives because his mother hides him, places him in a basket along the Nile River, and Pharaoh's daughter eventually raises him in the Egyptian palace. That means Moses grew up really between 2 identities. He was Hebrew by birth, but he was Egyptian by upbringing. He understands the suffering of his people, but he's also raised with Egyptian education, privilege, language, and culture. And already we begin seeing God is shaping Moses long before Moses really understands what God is doing. So this section is actually a great opportunity to go a lot deeper right now because it jumps really quickly from Moses killing the Egyptian to Midian in the wilderness without really exploring why did Moses act like he did, what Acts 7 reveals in just a few moments that we'll read, Moses' internal conflict, the difference between calling and timing, and human effort versus divine preparation. Right now it kind of feels like Moses is really messed up, right? He's made a terrible mistake. But the bigger issue is that Moses is trying to accomplish God's promise using human strength and timing. And this is where Acts 7 becomes really important because Stephen actually gives us information that Exodus doesn't explicitly spell out. So let's look at Acts chapter 7. And make sure I've got the right scriptures here. 23 through 25, I believe she's got noted here. Someone want to read that for us?
One day when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his relatives, the people of Israel. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite. So Moses came to the man's defense and avenged him, killing the Egyptian. Moses assumed his fellow Israelites would realize that God had sent him to rescue them, but they did not.
Yeah, so listen to that last line again. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. So Moses thought that his people would recognize, this is what God is calling me to do. He's calling me to rescue them. So that just really tells us that Moses already sensed a calling in his life. He really already sensed a purpose. He already sensed a burden. But you know what he did? He moved ahead of God's process, right? So,
Never
you know, what was that?
Never good.
Never good, right? Timing matters in building, right? So what's the title of your series that you guys are talking about?
Under construction.
Men under construction, right? So when you're in a building project, timing is everything. Now, some of you may not realize this, but we are in the middle of a little building project at our house. We are adding a 2-story, 600 square foot addition onto the back of our home. So we are building a full bedroom, full bathroom, bonus room on top. So we've got plumbing, we've got electricity, we've got new HVAC, we've got everything. And that process just started a few weeks ago. So this is extremely relevant to me as I'm learning a lot about building, and the process is the timing of how everything matters, right? A builder cannot skip curing time for concrete. They can't ignore foundational stages. They can't rush structural preparation, right? Moses wants visible purpose before the hidden preparation is complete, right? So right now in our home, we're in the process of making these, what we feel are pretty stressful and critical decisions. While everything is at the foundation stage, what parts of our house do we need to reinforce and fix and make right before they finish the drywall, right? Because once the drywall goes up, guess what? Everything is hidden behind those walls. So we've spent the last few weeks, we had, discovered, thankfully, I think it was, no pun intended, divine intervention that, the Lord revealed to us. One extremely critical structural detail that could have been catastrophic in our home. The supplier sent the wrong, I don't know if it's called ridge pole or structural beam for our roof line that holds our vaulted ceiling together. And so it looks fine to me, except there was something cosmetically I didn't like. And so I sort of just mentioned it. I said, I don't know, Kevin, I said, can you talk to the builder about da-da-da-da? I don't like the way these, collar ties look up here. Can we fix this? So the builder began investigating a little more, and after talking to the supplier and their engineer, they were like, oh, well, you're using 3 of these beams, right? And he said, no, we've just got 1. I said, well, why do you just have 1? So that's because that's all you sent us. You sent us 1. We thought this was the structural beam that would support this roof. And they said, oh, no, that was a mistake. We made a mistake. You should have gotten 3. Well, the rafters are up and everything, right? So they had to go back in and reinforce that to make sure that that roof line was structurally sound. We had another situation come up where we realized we had to have these ties, these tie downs that go from the first floor into the foundation and from the second floor into the first floor. These big metal cleat looking things, right, to help with shear wind, right, to make sure that that structure and that foundation, because once those walls go up, that drywall goes in there, you can't go back and do that without tearing everything apart, right? So that foundational piece is so important. So just like I said here, Moses wanted visible purpose before the hidden preparation was complete. So that hidden part, the things that are behind the walls, the things that are in the foundation are extremely important. So Moses tried to fulfill his calling on his own. And by Exodus 2, Moses is no longer a child in Pharaoh's palace. He is now an adult watching the suffering of the Hebrew people around him. And then Moses was not simply acting out of, there's an ant here. Okay. Moses was not simply acting out of random anger when he intervened between the Egyptian and the Hebrew slave. Somewhere deep inside Moses, there was already an awareness that his life was connected to something bigger. He knew he was Hebrew. He knew his people were suffering. And apparently, he already sensed that God had a purpose for him, right? But there's a major difference between receiving a calling and trying to force its fulfillment on yourself, right? So when Moses sees the Egyptian beating the Hebrew slave, something rises up inside of him. The injustice angers him deeply, but instead of waiting on God's direction, Moses acts impulsively. He kills the Egyptian and he hides the body in the sand. And this becomes one of the first major leadership lessons in Moses' life. Zeal alone is not enough. Moses had burden, he had passion, he even had some sort of awareness of his calling, but he lacked the preparation, the dependence, the humility, and the timing, right? Just like Stephen said in Acts 7, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. And that verse is really revealing. Moses expected the people to recognize his calling immediately, but instead of acceptance, he receives rejection. So we'll read on in Exodus 2, I believe it's verses 13 and 14 here. Does someone want to read that?
The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known.
Okay, so the next day when Moses tries to intervene between the two Hebrews that are fighting, one of them says, well, who made you the ruler and judge over us? Right? So this question really cuts deeply because it exposes something painful. Again, Moses has probably sensed his calling, but he had not really been prepared for the leadership. One of the difficult truths spiritually is that calling does not eliminate process. God may show someone early while still taking years to prepare their character for it. And this is where a lot of people become frustrated with God, right? They want that immediate fulfillment. They want to, be in the middle of that calling that they feel so strongly on their life, but God is still building foundations underneath that need to be in place, right? Just like in our building project, before those walls go up, they make sure that that structure is there.
I think when you're talking about that, I think I'm going back to like when people watch HGTV. In 30 minutes, you have a house complete, and so that builds so much zeal, but yet you don't see the time frame with all of that. And so people who watch those things and get into those projects thinking, oh, I can get, this is a quick fix, and they get in it and they realize they're way in over their head because their zeal got ahead of them, before they had the understanding of what it all entailed.
And I'll just add to that, if you want windows, you go in 6 to 8 weeks in advance.
Yes. There's a lot, things just don't, they're just not there.
Yeah.
I like this line that says, a structure may look finished externally while still lacking the strength to survive pressure. Right? I bet Moses really looked like a leader at that time, right? The structure looked finished externally, but it lacked the strength to survive the pressure. Moses wanted public usefulness before the hidden preparation was complete. So in Exodus 2:15, it says, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And suddenly, everything changes for Moses, right? The palace is gone, his position is gone, his reputation is gone, his future looks like it's ruined. Pharaoh seeks to kill him, and Moses flees into the wilderness of Midian. And what's fascinating is that the man who once grew up surrounded by Egyptian power now becomes a shepherd living quietly in obscurity.
After feels like he was called.
Yes, yes, after the calling,
So
right?
I'm like, that's a major step back in your mind. That's a major step back.
Yes. Yes, and this section, I'm not sure what's on your study sheets, but this section is entitled The Wilderness Between Calling and Fulfillment. So just like Ken said, one of the hardest places spiritually is that space between receiving the calling and seeing the calling fulfilled in your life, right? Moses probably believed his life was headed towards significance in Egypt, but instead he finds himself isolated in Midian, watching sheep in the wilderness.
In the meantime.
Yeah, in the meantime. Preaching it. He probably thinks too that he has messed up everything.
Beyond repair, right?
Yeah, beyond
right.
repair.
God can
He's,
use this now.
probably given up.
Yeah, and this statement I love too. It says, hidden seasons can feel deeply confusing because they often look nothing like what we expected. Have you ever had a season like that where your life looks really different than what you expected it was going to look like? Right? Career disappointments, broken plans, ministry discouragement, family struggles, waiting seasons, complete failure, uncertainty. And Moses spends 40 years in Midian, 40 years, right? That's longer than most people spend in an entire career. And yet those hidden years were not wasted years. God was still building something. So let's go to Exodus 3, verse 1. Does somebody want to read that?
One day Moses was tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. Keep going.
Yes, and, oh no, I think that's it, sorry, yes, sorry, I don't have the scripture numbers marked here, so. And during those 40 years, Moses carried something that every shepherd carried, a staff. Now, Amy prepared me with an object lesson today, so I'm so excited because, I was in shoulder lessons for a long time and I've missed doing object lessons. But this may look less like a shepherd's staff and a little more like a construction site, right? So the survey stake is something that's used before building begins. It helps establish direction, boundaries, alignment, and placement. Builders use it to make sure the structure starts correctly because if alignment is wrong at the beginning, problems spread everywhere else later. And that fits Moses' story better than we realize because God was doing far more in Midian than simply hiding Moses. He was aligning him, right? So, when Moses held the staff in his hands, it looked like an ordinary piece of wood. The staff represented, however, protection, guidance, support, correction, direction. Moses carried that staff through ordinary days that probably felt repetitive, quiet, and unnoticed. And I think one of the reasons this matters so deeply is because the staff represented the part of Moses' life that probably felt insignificant. It wasn't Pharaoh's scepter, it wasn't a symbol of Egyptian power, it wasn't something impressive, it represented wilderness life, right? The hidden years, the ordinary responsibilities, the daily faithfulness, and yet through scripture, God repeatedly chooses ordinary things that have been surrendered to him.
That's good.
Shepherding was not prestigious. In Egypt, shepherding was not considered impressive work. Genesis even tells us Egyptians viewed shepherds negatively. So think about this contrast, right? Moses once lived in Pharaoh's palace, and now he spends his days in the wilderness carrying a shepherd's staff. The man who once may have imagined leading nations is now leading sheep. But throughout the scripture, God repeatedly develops people in hidden places before that public usefulness. Remember, we're talking about men under construction. Right? Joseph spends years in prison before leadership. David spends years tending sheep before becoming a king. Paul spends years in obscurity after conversion before ministry expands. And now Moses spends decades in Midian. One of the uncomfortable truths about spiritual formation is that God often develops character in seasons that nobody applauds. There's no applause there. What I love, though, and one of the most beautiful things that I love about God is that the wilderness was not wasted.
That's good.
Moses may have viewed Midian as the place where his plans failed, but God viewed Midian as preparation. The wilderness teaches Moses things that Egypt never could. The wilderness teaches Moses dependence. It teaches him patience. It teaches him humility. It teaches him endurance, leadership, trust, and even shepherding itself becomes preparation for the calling that God has on Moses' life. Because before, what was that?
He works all things.
Works all things, yes. Because before Moses could shepherd a nation, he had to first learn how to shepherd sheep. And that pattern appears throughout scripture, right? David later writes in Psalm 78 that God took him from tending the sheep to shepherd Israel. Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. Throughout the Bible, shepherding becomes connected with leadership, care, protection, and guidance. And suddenly, Moses' hidden years begin carrying a much deeper meaning. One of the mistakes people make in construction is becoming obsessed with the visible progress while ignoring the preparation work, right? I mean, I want to shop for light fixtures and tile and, faucets and all the beautiful things, right, that go into this construction. But there's a lot of preparation that goes on, right, behind the scenes, behind those walls, before that beauty can take place.
I'll tell you this, it makes you want to give up too. That preparation part,
Yeah.
just because it's so fresh, but when Stephen came over to help me lay our new floor, he said, "Oh, we'll get this done in a day." 1 week later.
Yeah.
But, and there was one time where we sat in the room and we're like, I'm done. I'm calling the carpet people. We were gonna just give up.
Mhm.
Because all the prep work was, we just had to keep layering it, and we were done with it. We were tired of it, we were frustrated, we were wanting it to be over. But we were able to push through,
Mhm.
and now the results, you know, I couldn't be happier.
Yeah.
But in the middle of that preparation, in the middle of it, I wanted to quit. I was done. And I'm glad I did.
But had the foundation been right, it would have been a revenge job.
That's true.
Mhm.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Had there not been, you know, all those problems
Mhm.
that somebody else created, you know.
If you think about that stake that she has, that's a survey stake, with my dad's farm, we had an issue of ownership and authority with people moving their fence closer on, so we had to have resurvey done. And that survey stake allowed us to establish boundaries and ownership so that we could have the authority to tell them they were no longer able to possess that part of the land because they didn't own it. So sometimes if we don't have those things in our foundation and set to know who we are, then that way we know we have the authority when those times come of confrontation.
And that survey stake is pretty unimpressive,
It is.
right? But how important that it is.
It is. And it's costly. It's not something that you just get on the cheap on a clearance rack. Surveying your land is very costly.
Yes. It's a great segue to this next statement where, you know, foundations are hidden, support structures are hidden, reinforcement is hidden, but listen to this. But hidden work determines whether a structure survives pressure later. Right? What would have happened if you just laid that floor on that uneven slab?
Just the weight of walking and the furniture, it would have cracked and broke the.
That floor
The
would not have
joints?
survived.
No, it
Right?
wouldn't have-
Would not have survived the pressure.
It's
Right?
gonna be all right now.
Right, same with our project, right? If we hadn't made sure that there were those reinforcements that were there in the roof line and in the corners of the house, right? Who knows what kind of pressure would have succumbed to later on. And spiritually, God often works the same way. Why do you think that people struggle so much with hidden seasons?
Microwave society mindset, you know, the now.
Instant gratification.
But I just read a study where, not just read, but just a few months ago, where they talked about the games that you and I grew up on, were so different than what the games that the current generation is. Because we had a finish line, we had something, but these games are constant and they're ongoing, and there's no, because they keep you in that loop. And, you know, if you don't have that finish line to look forward to, then you'll just stay in that loop. So I think sometimes the struggle for us nowadays is because we're just in a loop, and we can't see the finish line. We don't know what the ultimate goal is, and I think that becomes a struggle for us. Is because we don't have the end result. You know, just figure it out just yet.
I think it's interesting, the series we were watching, you know, talked about having to endure different challenges and so forth, and said the most difficult part was not knowing when it was gonna be over. They kept subjecting these people in these, like, military type trainings
Yeah.
to go through these different ordeals where they just challenged them on and on. They said the hardest part was saying you never knew when the last one was, so you just kept going, not knowing, are we done after this, or we have to keep going, and that's what was so, you know, deflating, that, you know, that once you finally, if you had known when it was gonna be, a lot of times you can push through if you know the end is near, but trying to just keep working yourself up to get through it, not knowing if that was what's coming next, is what's so difficult mentally.
Yeah. It's like playing an inner game of tennis, back and forth, back and forth,
Yeah.
back and forth. Yeah.
My mind is also, I have to know the purpose of it. You know, what good does this do? You know, if I can grasp that, I can endure most things. But sometimes you don't get that until after the fact, until you look back and behind and you see it.
It's good.
So Moses thinks he's simply surviving in obscurity, but God is actually establishing alignment underneath the surface. One of the deepest truths in Moses' story is that God often begins with the very things people overlook: a shepherd's staff, hidden years, ordinary routines, wilderness seasons. But the very parts of life Moses may have viewed as insignificant become the places where God is preparing him the most deeply. Move on to part 2, the burning bush and Moses' excuses. And from the beginning of Exodus 3, Moses has now spent 40 years in Midian, 40 years of obscurity, 40 years of routine, 40 years carrying the same staff through the same wilderness. And then, again, one of the things that stands out is how ordinary this day initially appears. Moses wakes up expecting another normal day, another day of tending sheep, another day in the wilderness, another day carrying that same staff he's been carrying for decades. And before the day ends, everything changes. One of the patterns that you'll notice in Scripture is that God frequently enters people's lives during ordinary moments. Let's look at Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, if somebody wants to read that.
An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground.
Moses has lived in the wilderness for decades, so he understands the desert environment. Fires by themselves are not shocking, but what's shocking and what captures Moses' attention here is that the bush continues to burn without being destroyed. Right? Fire in Scripture often represents God's holiness, His presence, purification, power. The bush is not consumed. The presence of God is resting on something ordinary without destroying it. And that becomes a beautiful picture of grace. As Moses approaches, God calls his name, right? Can't you hear it in the Ten Commandments movie? Moses, Moses, right? Moses responds, Here I am. And God says, Take off your sandals, for the place that you're standing is holy ground. In the presence of God, God's presence changes environments, right? So that was just dirt that was there. But when God's presence was there, the whole environment changed and it became holy ground. I think what's beautiful here, and one of the things that Amy had pointed out, is that God calls Moses by name. So after 40 hidden years, God still sees him. After failure in Egypt, God still sees him. After decades in obscurity, God still sees him. And there are people who need to remember that in the hidden seasons, that does not equal your forgotten season. God still knows your name. Somebody want to read Exodus 3, verses 7 through 10.
And the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. And I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them from the land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. 13. Therefore, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh, so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Can you imagine that moment? I mean, he spent 40 years in obscurity tending sheep. And then suddenly, God says, on this ordinary day, now I want you to go. I'm going to send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And can you imagine that weight of that moment? Right? So, and suddenly, the other part that I think is an excellent point I hadn't really thought about before is that God calls him back to the very place that was connected to his greatest failure. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine the thoughts in his mind? Like, why would I go back there? That's where I messed up.
Yeah, God, I tried that once, it didn't work.
Exactly. Exactly. Didn't you love that? So then Moses begins making excuses. I mean, who wouldn't, right? He immediately begins resisting the calling that he was so eager to rush into the first time before he made this mistake, right? This is the story that becomes incredibly human, right? Because he responds exactly like probably every single one of us in this room would do, right? Excuse number 1 in Exodus 3, 11 and 12. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you, and this will be a sign to you that this is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Right, so Moses, grew up in Pharaoh's palace, and he now sees himself as a shepherd in the wilderness. He's having this identity crisis, but these years in Midian have really humbled him. Again, earlier in his life, he probably had the confidence to go right out there and say, I can do this, this is who I am. But now he has to have the confidence with the dependence of God. Why do you think that people struggle so much with feelings of inadequacy when God calls them to do something? Right? He's like, who am I that I should go and do this?
I think it makes you lean on God more.
Yeah.
That's why God waited 40 years. Because Moses was ready back then, and then when God finally says, okay, and he's like, really now you're gonna call me?
Mm-hmm.
And then he felt inadequate. So God used that time to humble him.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue, because I think what Moses, he asked him a question, and he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And I have a tendency to do this as a parent, I want to boost my kids' confidence and say, oh, you can do this, you've got this in you, you've got whatever, but God doesn't say that. He says, I'll be with you. Right? That makes a big difference.
You can't, but I can.
Right. So the solution to Moses' inadequacy is not self-confidence, it's God's presence.
Right.
It's God's presence.
Cause my do it myself didn't work.
Yeah, I can do it by myself.
Yeah.
Right? That's what he thought the first time.
Yeah.
That was his attitude the first time. In his 40 years in the wilderness, he was like, I can't do this by myself. And God says, that's okay. I'm going to be here. I'll be right with you. You don't have to do it by yourself. Somebody want to read Exodus 4:1. What's another excuse that he has?
And Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee.
Right? So Moses is like, well, they are not going to believe me when I say this, right? And then what about 4:10?
And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since. Thou hast spoken unto thy servant, I'm slow of speech and of slow tongue.
Right? So the first, excuse was, well, who am I to do this? The second one was, well, what if they don't believe me? He's still trying to get out of it. He says, well, I can't really speak that great. I'm not super eloquent there, so maybe somebody else. Send anybody else, right? But I think beneath the excuses is one central fear. What if I'm not enough?
Yes.
And this leads us to one of the most important moments in the lesson, and I'll wrap up here. There's so much more to say, but I think this is a great point to bring out. And then what does Exodus 4 verse 2 says?
The Lord asked him, what is in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied.
Yeah, so God says, well, what's in your hand? And Moses said, a staff. Well, God knew that. God knew he was holding a staff, right? He wasn't asking him for his information.
Right.
He was asking him for Moses' understanding, right? So God's drawing Moses' attention to something Moses has carried for years without realizing how God could use it, right? So, the staff, just like the survey stake, just represents something ordinary, right? His wilderness years, his routine, his limitations, his shepherd identity, the part of his life that probably felt really insignificant. Just like this is pretty insignificant, right? We don't think a whole lot about just a stick that goes in the ground. Yet God chooses the very thing that Moses viewed as ordinary. God begins a lot of times in people's lives by drawing attention to what's already in their hands, right? Not because the object itself is powerful, but because people frequently overlook what God has already provided. Moses sees a shepherd's staff, God sees a surrendered instrument. David sees a sling, God sees a giant falling. A widow sees a nearly empty jar of oil, God sees provision. A little boy sees 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus sees a miracle about to feed thousands. The disciples see empty fishing nets, and Jesus sees overflowing abundance. And spiritually, I think many people spend their lives focused on what they lack while overlooking what God has already placed in their hands. The staff wasn't random. Moses had carried it through ordinary days, lonely seasons, wilderness wandering, daily responsibilities, hidden years nobody applauded. The very object connected to Moses' obscurity becomes connected to God's calling. You know, I think a lot of people assume that God only uses impressive people with impressive resources, right? But God repeatedly works through surrendered, ordinary things. Let me see where I can move us forward here a little bit. One of the things I think that's important about the staff that Moses had is that, you know, God is drawing attention to what Moses was carrying, but it wasn't just about the object. He's drawing attention to everything that Moses has learned while he was carrying that staff. So that staff represents 40 years of wilderness experience, 40 years of learning terrain, learning endurance, learning leadership, learning patience, learning dependence, and interestingly, learning how to guide stubborn sheep through difficult places. Right? I think that last one is going to become very useful to him a few years later, learning how to guide stubborn sheep through difficult places. So Moses probably thought that Midian was the place where his dreams died, but God was quietly equipping him the entire time. Before Moses could lead a nation through the wilderness, he first had to survive the wilderness himself. Before Moses could shepherd people, he had to shepherd sheep. Before Moses could depend on God publicly, he had to learn dependence privately. And, you know, back to the construction theme, you know, I think one of the things builders understand is that preparation work rarely looks exciting while it's happening, right? The skill development, the training, the alignment, the reinforcement, all the work that nobody notices until it becomes the very thing that allows the structure to survive the pressure later. Moses saw a shepherd's tool. God saw years of preparation attached to it. Right? I think many believers underestimate how God has already been equipping them through seasons they considered ordinary. The difficult season taught them endurance. The caregiving season taught compassion. The workplace that taught discipline. The parenting years that taught patience. The failures that taught humility. And the waiting that taught dependence. And a lot of times the very experiences that we would remove from our story become the experiences God later uses the most powerfully. Moses thought his greatest qualification had been Egypt, but Egypt gave him the education, Midian gave him formation. Egypt gave Moses position, but Midian gave Moses character. So God is asking, when he holds up his staff, he says, you know, Moses, are you willing to place even the ordinary parts of your life into my hands? God is looking for those surrendered hearts. In Exodus 4, 3-5, somebody want to read that part? It's just more about the staff and what God uses as this ordinary part of his calling.
Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand.
So this moment carries enormous symbolism because throughout Egyptian culture, serpents represented power and authority. Pharaoh's crown even contained serpent imagery. And suddenly the object representing Moses' ordinary shepherd life becomes a demonstration that God's authority is greater than Egypt's authority. One of the hardest parts of surrender is that surrender requires release. Moses could not cling tightly to the staff while also placing it into God's hands. The staff looked ordinary while Moses held it for himself, but once he surrendered his staff to God, it became connected to something greater, right? The power was in the surrender. The staff was not magical, it was simply surrendered to God. And we're short on time, but you've got your study sheet there. One of the things it talks about is how this staff in the last part of this lesson appears again and again throughout Moses' story, right? Not because the wood itself contained any power, but because that staff became a reminder that once it was surrendered to God, right, that full dependence on Him, then that's where the real victory comes into play. The staff was raised over battle. It was the Red Sea moment that was lifted up. It kept them victorious throughout many battles that they had. And it was the obedience that he had when he surrendered that ordinary part of what he learned through the wilderness, through this staff, that really became his power and his strength in this men under construction section. So we know that at the end of this story, the staff has become much more than a shepherd's tool. It represents surrender, dependence, obedience, leadership, God's authority working through human weakness. The same staff Moses once carried quietly in obscurity became connected to moments where entire nations witnessed God's power. And the remarkable thing is this: the staff itself never changed. Moses changed, his surrender changed, and his willingness changed. In a final reflection, one of the lessons Moses teaches us is that God often begins with ordinary, surrendered lives. The question is not whether or not what we hold seems impressive. The question is whether we are willing to place it in God's hands. Because throughout Scripture, God repeatedly builds extraordinary things through surrendered weakness. Any final thoughts? Well, thank you all again for bearing with me this morning. I know Amy will be anxious to get back to you all next week. Look forward to hearing Pastor Ken this morning.